There I was, alone in the office, the clock striking midnight. The hum of the air conditioning was the only sound breaking the eerie silence that had settled. The building, usually teeming with life, was deserted, an empty shell that echoed my solitary footsteps. My desk, nestled in the corner of the room, was bathed in the dim glow of a single overhead lamp, its light flickering intermittently like a heartbeat on the edge of stopping. The silence was oppressive, wrapping around me like a shroud. Each tick of the clock reverberated through the empty hallways, a metronome marking the passage of time in the stillness. The air was heavy, as if charged with anticipation, a chilling sensation creeping up my spine that left me with the distinct feeling of being watched. Despite the logical part of my brain dismissing it as mere paranoia, the sensation persisted. It was a quiet, unnerving whisper in the back of my mind, a nagging suspicion that I was not as alone as I should have been. It was as if the office itself had come alive, its walls closing in, whispering secrets in a language only the shadows understood. The climax came unannounced. The sound of footsteps, faint yet unmistakable, echoed down the hallway. Each step was a deliberate invasion of the silence, growing louder, closer. I froze, my breath hitching in my chest as a shadowy figure loomed in the doorway. The factory at night was a different beast, its silence echoing with past labors. During the day, it was a cacophony of industry. But the night shift, well, that was a different song altogether. The machines, having fired up all day, creaked and groaned as they cooled, their noises bouncing off the cold steel walls. That symphony of sounds, while initially disconcerting, became my nightly lullaby. The industrial lighting cast long, distorted shadows that danced on the walls, creating a macabre puppet show for an audience of one. These shadows, coupled with the factory's eerie soundscape, twisted the familiar into the unknown. My mind began to weave tales of unseen entities lurking in the corners. I knew it was just my imagination, but the factory had a way of making you doubt your sanity. One night, as I was operating the lathe, I heard a scream from the far end of the factory. The sound was sharp, a human cry of fear or pain that was abruptly cut off. It was impossible. I was the only one there. The rest of the factory was supposed to be deserted. Summoning the courage I didn't know I had, I walked towards the scream's origin, my heart pounding like a drum. The factory's symphony of sounds had taken a sinister turn. Every creak, every groan seemed to be warning me, telling me to turn back, but I had to know. When I reached the deserted section, I saw a wrench lying on the floor, still spinning as if it had been dropped, but there was no one there, no sign of anyone having been there. The wrench spun for a few more seconds, then stopped, as if whatever unseen hand that had dropped it had finally let it rest. That night I realized the factory wasn't just a building, it was an entity, alive with the echoes of its past. The factory was silent, but its machinery had a life of its own. Remote work sites are isolating during the day, but at night they turn into a stage for the inexplicable. This was my reality one late evening when I found myself alone at a remote work site nestled deep in the heart of the wilderness. The sun had long since set, leaving behind a blanket of darkness only interrupted by the feeble glimmer of my solitary worklight. The silence was deafening, save for the occasional rustle of leaves, the hooting of an owl, or the distant howl of a coyote. It was as if nature itself was whispering ghost stories in my ear. As the hours ticked by, an unsettling sensation began to creep over me. It was a distinct feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes fixating on me from the shadows. I tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to the isolation and the late hour, but the sensation persisted, growing stronger with each passing minute, turning the benign wilderness into a theater of perceived threats. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted it, a shadowy figure moving in the woods. My heart pounded in my chest as I squinted into the darkness, trying to discern what it was. Was it an animal, a person, or something else entirely? Gathering my courage, I decided to investigate, flashlight in hand. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the feeling of being watched intensified. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot seemed to echo ominously around me. But as I reached the spot where I had seen the figure, I found nothing. No traces of anyone or anything. The wilderness around me was as undisturbed as it had been before. Yet, despite the apparent tranquility, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. That somewhere, in the dark recesses of the wilderness, something was watching me. As I returned to the safety of the worksite, I couldn't help but glance back at the woods one last time, the shadows seeming to dance and shift with a life of their own. The wilderness was quiet, but I was not alone. Different places, different times, one common thread, the unsettling feeling of working alone at night. These tales, though diverse in their settings and circumstances, all converge on a singular, universal emotion: fear. Fear of the dark, fear of the unknown, fear of being alone. It's a primordial dread that's been etched into our DNA since the dawn of humanity, when nightfall meant the awakening of predators, both seen and unseen. Consider the office worker, absorbed in the glow of their computer screen, yet acutely aware of the ominous silence that pervades the empty building. Or the factory worker whose senses are heightened by the mechanical hum and rhythm, yet unnerved by the eerie shadows that play tricks on their mind. And let's not forget the remote site worker, isolated and vulnerable, where every rustle and creak is amplified by the stillness of the night. In these scenarios, a simple shift in perspective can morph ordinary settings into breeding grounds for terror. A flickering light becomes a spectral presence. A sudden gust of wind, a phantom sigh. The mind, fueled by fear, conjures up threats where none exist. This is the power of the imagination, a survival mechanism turned tormentor when left unchecked. Yet paradoxically, this fear also connects us. It's a shared experience, a common thread that binds us together. We've all felt that prickling sensation at the back of our necks, that quickening of the pulse when we're alone in the dark. It's a reminder of our vulnerability, our mortality, but also of our shared humanity. So, while we may shudder at these tales of nocturnal terror, let's also take solace in the knowledge that we are not alone in our fears. We are all, in some form or another, afraid of the dark. And in this shared fear, we find a strange sense of comfort and camaraderie. In the end, the true horror was not what lurked in the shadows, but the fear within us. As the sun rises, the horrors of the night retreat, leaving only memories and unease. The veil of darkness is lifted, and the world returns to its familiar form, but the echoes of the night's terrors linger, their impressions etched deep within our minds. These stories we've shared today, though disparate in their settings, an office, a factory, a remote site, are bound by a common thread: the chill of isolation, the weight of the unseen, the dread of the unknown. It's not the darkness itself that frightens us, but what the darkness hides, what it allows our minds to conjure. Our fear, you see, is a powerful storyteller. It weaves tales from the shadows, crafts narratives from the silence. It fills the empty spaces with specters of its own making, and in the lonely hours of the night, it can transform the mundane into the monstrous. As we've journeyed through these narratives, we've not just explored the external horrors that lurk in the late hours of the work night. We've delved into the internal landscapes of fear, the psychological constructs that can make a whisper seem like a wail, a flicker seem like a phantom. We are all authors of our own horror stories, penning chapters every time we find ourselves alone in the dead of night. The office becomes a haunted mansion, the factory a phantom-filled fortress, the remote site a crypt of creeping shadows. Our minds, left to their own devices, become fertile ground for fear's twisted tales. But as we share these stories, we're reminded that we are not alone in our fears, that others too have stood in the face of the unseen, have felt the chill of the unknown, have heard the whispers of the night. And in this shared fear, we find a strange comfort, a communal courage. As we face our fears, we realize the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.